In the ancient Greek world, people were afraid of lightning and thunder, so they postulated gods of lightning and gods of thunder. Now, a very brief encounter with atmospheric physics, that god with a small g will disappear. It was a god of the gaps and it's squeezed out. But then there are very different kind of gaps. I call them good gaps as distinct from bad gaps, and they're the ones that science reveals.
Well, Dr. Lennox, I'm so excited to have you on this program. I've been following your work for a long time. It's been, at a personal level, very influential on the way that I've thought about God and his connection to science. And so it's kind of surreal to actually now be able to talk to you sort of through this face-to-face, digital format. But I'm extremely excited. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to meet you for the first time, and at least on this show.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, the first, I guess by way of intro, what I thought would be an interesting way of opening up to the ideas here, there was a debate that you had with Richard Dawkins. It was the one under the shadow of the giant dinosaur skeleton at the Oxford Natural History Museum. And the topic was, has science buried God? At a particular point in that debate, you guys were going back and forth, and you made this claim. You said, as an inference to the best explanation of the universe, which makes more sense? And you basically said the logos, which is the idea of a mind, or the idea of matter. And you sort of suggested that Richard Dawkins ends up having to believe the universe as a brute fact. And then he responded and he said the universe is an easier brute fact to accept than a conscious creator. And so I guess my question is that kind of what that origin of universe conversation boils down to? Is my assessment of that correct first? And then you're on the side of arguing for mind as a better explanation for the world that we all inhabit. And I'm fascinated to kind of hear you unpack why that is.
Okay, well, that's two questions, so let's have a look at them. The first is the basic issue in that debate with Dawkins, which was the second major debate I had with him, was that he claims that if you believe that God created the universe, then you will have to logically be able to ask the question, who created God? And then you're going to be asking an infinite sequence of questions, who created the creator that created, and so on and so forth. And I was making the point that that sounds very plausible. In fact, that argument as to who created God formed the central, to my amazement, the central argument of his book, The God Delusion. It was his way of dismissing God. It's such a ridiculous thing to have a backward sequence of infinite questions, who created them, and so on. But I made the point that if you ask the question, who created God, or who created anything, let's call it X, then you're assuming that X is created. So the very formulation of his question is assuming that he's talking about a created God. And of course, created gods are what we normally call idols, and we don't have to turn to Richard Dawkins to know that they're a delusion. The point is that what he's forgetting is the biblical claim that the God who created the universe is himself uncreated but eternal. And that is basically the point I was making. If you're going to ask who created the creator, then you're assuming the creator was created. But the sting in the tail for him was, he believes the universe created him. So if his question is legitimate, I put it to him, then I can rightly ask you, who created your creator? And of course, he's no answer to that. And I've been waiting many years to hear it. So it's a simple confusion. The basic idea behind it all is, do the questions go backwards forever or not? And the answer is that they don't, not on either side. The ultimate reality for a Christian believer like myself is God, uncreated and eternal. And the ultimate reality for many atheists is the universe, mass energy, or these days the most popular one is simply nothing. But nothing has to be redefined in a very special way as a quantum vacuum. And I've dealt with that in detail in one of my books. So that's the basic issue there. Now, what was your second question?
My second question, and perfect dovetail into it, was with that groundwork being laid, then why, in your view, is the mind of God, or that idea of eternal, uncaused consciousness or intelligence, why is that a better explanation for the reality that we all inhabit than the alternative explanations to it?
Well, the alternative that you mention is regarding the universe as a brute fact. And that is scientifically very unsatisfactory for the first thing to say. Paul Davies, who's a physicist and not a theist, he is desperately dissatisfied with that kind of attitude, that we ask for the origin of everything, but except for the whole universe itself. And we're content with regarding it as a brute fact. That's very unscientific. But secondly, the precise question as to whether I believe there's a mind behind the universe, that depends on very different kinds of evidence. And the two that I would advance are these. One, the universe is, at least in part, mathematically describable. It's describable in terms of a very sophisticated language. Now, all our experience of language is that it proceeds from a mind. Now, it's not only that, but in biology, we've discovered the longest word that we know to exist, a chemical word, which is the human genome, with 3.4 billion chemical letters in exactly the right order, with a semiotic semantic dimension. It codes for the proteins and so on. So those, to my mind, are very powerful pointers that the origin is not less than mind. It certainly could well be more than mind, but we fly against every analogy that we know if we're not prepared to postulate mind. Now, the final point here is I often test this with scientists, and I ask them to give me a reductionist explanation of, say, the word roast chicken. Let's take the word roast on a menu, R-O-A-S-T. If they're reductionists like Dawkins and they believe that it can all be explained in terms of physics and chemistry, I say, you look at that and what do you see? And they say roast. What does that mean? And they explain what that means. And I say, how do you know what it means? Well, of course, they know that because they've learned English. Now, I said, if you're a reductionist, then please explain to me how those marks on paper, the letters R-O-A-S-T, carry meaning. And if you're a reductionist, you must be able to do that in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And of course, they cannot do it because they know that even a 5-letter word like R-O-A-S-T, roast, they immediately infer that irrespective of the many processes, mechanical or otherwise, that put that word on the menu, they know there must be a mind behind it. And so therefore, what we're saying is this is the logical extension of all our experience, and no one would ever think of calling that mind a mind of the gaps, or that I was being very lazy and postulating a mind behind the word roast chicken on a menu, because it's in the nature of things that in order to explain it, physics and chemistry of paper and ink are simply inadequate. You have to allow a much bigger source of real explanatory power, and the only one is mind. So I approach it in that kind of way.
This is interesting because I have left commentary and posted some of your lectures and debates and things before on this channel. And one of the common comments that I see that comes up continuously, and to me, it seems almost like a predetermined response that someone has learned to say. It's the idea of, we don't know, therefore God. But what you're saying here with your roast analogy is something different than that. But I think it would be helpful for those people who I can tell at this point in the conversation are itching to type in, we don't know, therefore God. Can you give an example of what a legitimate God of the gaps argument would be? And then by contrast, help us distinguish between that and what it is that you are actually saying.
I think the short answer to that question is there are different kind of gaps in our knowledge. There are gaps that science closes. For example, in the ancient Greek world, people were afraid of lightning and thunder, so they postulated gods of lightning and gods of thunder. Now, a very brief encounter with atmospheric physics, that god with a small g will disappear. It was a god of the gaps and it's squeezed out. But then there are very different kind of gaps. I call them good gaps as distinct from bad gaps, and they're the ones that science reveals. And of course, the example of the menu is one of those, that it's not within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry to explain meaning and language and semiotics. And most people, when they're faced with a question, will realize that instantly. You have to be pretty obstinate, a pretty obstinate materialist to go against that. And we must realize that when people like Isaac Newton made their major discoveries, like his law of gravitation, he did not say, now I understand how it works, I don't need God to do it. What he did was the exact opposite of that. He wrote probably the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica. And at least in the early editions of it, he said he hoped it would persuade a thinking person to believe in God. In other words, the law of gravitation, which is a work of genius, was saying to Newton what a brilliant God it is who did it that way. So that the more he knew of science, the more he thought he was seeing God at work. And of course, a moment's thought shows that that's the way our minds work in everyday experience. The more I know of painting, the more I recognize the genius of Rembrandt, not the less. The more I know of engineering, the more I will recognize the genius of the people that designed the space shuttle, not the less. And so, in other words, as science expands, then my worship for God increases. Now, there's something at the heart of this, Brandon, that's very important. And that's the way in which people like particularly Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, insisted that you have to choose between God and science. Dawkins is a bit like that, but Hawking was very much like that. And I couldn't fathom why he thought that way for a very long time until I realized that he had two fundamental problems. The first was, and this was very strange to me, he didn't really understand certain things about science and the way it works. And the second thing he didn't understand is the nature of God. So let me just take those two things briefly. You see, the idea that God and science are competing explanations is a failure to understand the nature of explanation itself. Easy way to illustrate this is to think of the question, why is the water boiling? It's boiling because there's heat energy from a gas flame, let's say, being conducted through the copper kettle, agitating the molecules of water, and so the water is boiling. That's a scientific explanation in terms of heat transfer. But I could equally well validly say, the water is boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, that is an agent explanation, a personal explanation. But anybody can see, and I find children can sometimes see it more rapidly than professors, sadly, that you need both explanations to get a full explanation. In other words, both of them are simultaneously true. They do not conflict, they do not compete, they complement each other because they're different kinds of explanation. And to put it very simply, God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with automobile engineering as an explanation for the motor car. You need both. And explanation is a very key issue here. Once you begin to see that, then just as you admire Henry Ford's genius when you see the motor car, so you can admire God's genius because there's not a competition there. There's simply complementary explanations with explanatory power that copes with the total situation. Although I would hasten to add, as a scientist, that scientific explanation is rarely even complete at a scientific level. For instance, I mentioned the law of gravitation. Well, does it explain gravity? The answer to that is no. Many people think it does. But Newton realized that it doesn't. He said, he said it in Latin, non fingo hypothesi, I do not make hypotheses. In other words, I do not know what this mysterious gravity is. What I can do is give you a mathematical way of calculating its effect. But that's a very different thing from knowing what it is. Nobody yet really knows what it is. So even within its own limitations, a scientific explanation is rarely exhaustive. So if we stand back from that, we see that this idea of explanation leads us to postulate an intelligent God who creates but isn't competing with a scientific explanation, but actually makes sense of the scientific explanation, which is another dimension here. Now, the final point here is that very often when we're talking with people like Hawking or reading what they have to say, their idea of God is defective, and that's why they make another mistake. They're thinking of God as a kind of Greek god of the gaps, of the type that I mentioned. But you see, as I often say to people, the first statement in the Bible is not, in the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand, but it's God created the heavens and the earth. That is the whole show, everything, the bits we do understand, the bits we don't. And on the basis of my analogy of automobile engineering and painting and so on, it's the bits we do understand that actually are pointers towards the existence of an intelligent God, because he, as explanation, is not competing with science as explanation. There's a great deal of intellectual fog here, Brandon.
We are coming up against this big obstacle because I everything that you're saying is completely reasonable and profound and brilliant, and I'm tracking with you and I love it. And yet I think of some, at a personal level, some of the friends that I went to high school with whose acquaintance with Christian ideas took place when they were in their teenage years and their elementary years, but then they went on to university and they kind of got this worldview that science has pushed God out, that that's for children, that that's when you grew up, but now you're an adult and now you can see the world in a more reasonable, rational way. And I think it's interesting because what you're saying contends directly with that idea that a purely materialistic model is the best explanation of the whole cosmos as we know it and of the human experience. Now, when you more recently were on the Jordan Peterson podcast, you made this statement that I think kind of gets right to where we're coming in this conversation that I thought was very succinct, very, very interesting. And here's what you said, that science and faith actually do sit comfortably together, but that atheism and science do not. And I was curious if you could sort of unpack both sides of that. We're already sort of getting into that, but in people's mind, again, I think there's this strong obstacle that the second you bring up faith, you've just left adult thinking. You've left, reasonableness. And maybe you can help us think through this.
Okay. Well, again, that's a multi-part question, so we'll have to separate it out a
Sure.
little bit. First of all, there are several things here. There is, first of all, why science sits very comfortably with God. Well, the first thing to say is the obvious one. It's the history of modern science. We've talked about Newton, but if you start a bit earlier with Galileo and Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, all of these pioneers, the great geniuses of modern science, were all believers in God. And that fact has been noticed and taken seriously by historians and philosophers of science. And there's general agreement, with variations and nuances, that, well, let's quote C.S. Lewis on this, because he put it very well when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, a lawgiver. And that makes me not remotely ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian tradition, the biblical worldview, that gave me my subject. They saw no inconsistency, or to put it another way, the faith in God of the pioneer scientists didn't hinder their science. It actually was the motor that drove it. So we have science in its modern origins sitting very comfortably with faith in God. Now, why does atheism not sit comfortably? Well, that brings me to your question about faith. Faith is a concept massively misunderstood, mainly because of the work of Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, who redefined faith as a religious concept, which means believing where there's no evidence. Now, that is dangerously misleading. That kind of faith, believing where there's no evidence, is blind faith, and it can be very dangerous. That's the kind of faith that causes people to drive large aircraft into tall buildings and create catastrophe. But you see, they make a serious mistake, people who think that way. Faith is not a merely religious word. It is an ordinary word. It, in English, comes from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity. And we talk about it every day. You might have a favorite football team and you say, well, I've got faith in what? The Kansas Red Sox, or whatever they're called, something like that. Or somebody else has got faith in the stock market, or they've faith that we're going to get out of the recession. And what we need to realize here that is, firstly, everybody is a person of faith. Now, unfortunately, the word faith now splits into two very separate groups of meaning. The first is faith in the sense of religion. That is like the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, and so on. But then there's faith in the sense of my personal belief. So that whenever I use the word faith, I'm always very careful to answer the logical question, faith in what? Because I have faith in God. I also have faith in my wife, as I discovered Richard Dawkins had. And he believes it's evidence-based faith, which is very interesting. And we had a wonderful moment of humor in my first debate with him. As you can see, if you watch it, that's the Alabama debate, the God delusion debate that I had about 14 years ago. But the interesting thing here is that all scientists are people of faith. Now, that might shock some of your audience, but Einstein saw it clearly. He put it this way. He said, I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. Now, he wasn't referring to faith in God. He was referring to the faith without which science cannot be done. if you're going to do science, you've got to believe, have faith in, trust that the human mind can access aspects of the universe and understand it. You can do no science unless you believe that. So this is what has often been called the credo of scientists. And my teacher of quantum mechanics at Cambridge many years ago, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, the late Professor Polkinghorne, used to write in his books, which are well worth reading, that physics is powerless to explain its faith in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, simply because you've got to believe that before you can do any physics at all. Now, that's hugely important. So this idea of saying faith on one side and science in the other is nonsense. You can talk about faith in God and faith in science, or of faith in anything, and once I declare that I believe something, I have faith in it, you have every right to say on the basis of what evidence. Now, here's the crucial thing. I claim that Christianity sits very comfortably with science, but atheism doesn't. Why not? Well, think about it. I often have fun with leading scientists, and it leads to a very interesting conversation. I ask them what they do science with, and I point up to here. And they said, "Oh, you don't mean my machines in my lab?" I said, No. And they say, "You mean and they're about to say mind, when they realize that in some scientific circles it's not politically correct to talk of the mind as distinct from the brain. I believe they're distinct, but I let it go. "You mean my brain? Okay, tell me," I say to them, "give me the brief history of the brain and its origins." And it amounts to something like this. They'll say, well, the brain is the end product of a sequence of unguided natural processes in the history of the universe. They give me an evolutionary explanation. And I just look at them and smile, and I said, "And you trust it? Now tell me honestly," and I put this to many people, "tell me honestly, if you knew that the apparatus you're going to use in the lab tomorrow, or your computer, let's say, was the end product of a sequence of unguided natural processes, would you trust it?" And I have always had the answer, no. So I say, you've got a problem. You are telling me that you trust your mind, your brain, to do science, and yet your explanation of its origin undermines rationality. And I say that's pretty serious, because you're not just shooting yourself in the foot, which is painful, you're shooting yourself in the brain, which is fatal. In other words, that is what I'm saying. And it encourages me that a leading philosopher who is an atheist in New York, Thomas Nagel, is saying exactly the same thing. That if you take evolutionary naturalism as an explanation for the brain, then you end up undermining rationality, the rationality needed not only to do science, but to do any thinking, any discussion, any conversation at all. That's why I believe that atheism and science are very uncomfortable bedfellows.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick 1-minute halftime break here from the conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. But now we're going to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Policy Genius. Their basic proposal is that if you have people you love relying on your income, it would be wise to get life insurance, which I agree with. Then if you're going to get life insurance, the question becomes, how do you get the best deal? And how do you know that you're getting the best deal? So that is what they do. That is how they help. They give you free quotes from America's top insurers. You'll have access to licensed experts who work for you, not the insurance companies. Their guidance is unbiased and trustworthy, since they're literally just matching your budget with the best possible deal. taking a lot of that legwork out, taking a lot of the trial and error out of it. So with Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams as well. So save yourself some time and money and provide your family with a financial safety net using Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com/daily dose of wisdom or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. With that being said, let's get back into this. This is going to be somewhat of a pivot, but you'll see, I think, the connection between the point that you've just made and where I kind of want to go next, which is to the probably most well-known allegory, at least as far as I'm aware, in Western philosophy, which is Plato's Cave. And I think it's fascinating because it deals with the idea of desire and when you see the sun versus the shadows that you've seen, and there's a lot of complexity around desire and around the will and how that ties in to I guess this conversation between God and science, but really what I'm really thinking about is faith and I guess our desire for God or away from God in light of what we know about him or know about his character or want him to be real or don't want him to be real. I know I'm throwing a lot of things at you, but I'm leading into Plato's Cave. And I guess my question broadly, I won't direct it, is do you see Plato's Cave as connecting in any way to Christianity? That's probably my question at the broadest level.
I use Plato's Cave a great deal in teaching very high-powered executives and leaders in industry, business, law, politics, all the rest of it, because it's an exploration really with an exploration of perception and the idea, and I don't know how many of your watchers will know what the allegory is. It's briefly this, that you've got a group of prisoners who have been maintained in a cave for many years, and they're shackled in such a way that they can only look straight forward. And all they can see in front of them are shadows on a wall. The shadows are cast by objects that are moving behind their heads and a fire that's behind the objects so that the shadows are projected from those objects. And since the prisoners can't turn their heads, all they can see is what is on the wall in front of them. And then one of them gets released, and he's taken up to the outer world where the sun is blazing in its strength. And of course, he's blinded initially, but then he gets used to it and realizes that there's a much bigger world up there. Now, it seems to me that what Plato is getting at, amongst other things, is the idea that people in general are sitting in a cave, though they don't realize it, and they see shadows on the wall that are realities of a certain kind, but there's a transcendent world that's much brighter. There's a much greater reality outside the cave. Now, that to me is a brilliant parable of the cave, the dark cave in which materialism, naturalism have put people, because it's based on a denial of the transcendent. And it's very interesting in the case of C.S. Lewis, because when he began to realize that there might be something more, he was almost blinded and disorientated by it. But yet, in the end, he came to see the sun. And of course, he projects the whole Plato Cave story into one of his Narnia books and does it absolutely brilliantly. So you can use that to discuss different levels of reality. And of course, leadership comes into it, because after all, it was written in Plato's Republic, where he was talking about how government should work. And leadership is leading people from the darkness to the light. And one of the problems was that when the man who was released from the cave went back down into the cave to bring the good news to the people down there, of course, he was blinded by the darkness now, and they thought he was a complete fool. And Plato very interestingly mentions the possibility that they would kill him. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus, that he claimed to be from the world above. And he told a parable that relates to Plato's cave. It's not dependent on it, of course, but relates to it. That when he came down and tried to bring his light, the light of the world, into that cave, they rejected him and they crucified him. So there are all kinds of levels at which that can be used. The wonderful thing about the parable is, as you say, that there are so many different interpretations of it. It's interesting.
It is. And I love that you just connected this to C.S. Lewis, because I wanted to, my understanding is that when you were a younger man, you had the privilege of sitting in on some of C.S. Lewis's final lectures. And at the same time, far more recently, you have had the privilege of having a long form conversation with Dr. Peterson, which we already alluded to earlier. For me, I've been looking at the thought trajectory of C.S. Lewis and the thought trajectory of Jordan Peterson, and I see some similarities in their thinking. I'm curious if you do as well, and what maybe you can share, having this kind of unique connection point to these two thinkers. In particular, I'm thinking of Jordan Peterson has a moment in one video where he's thinking about John 1:1. And he says it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. He cries at the idea of the, quote, narrative world and the objective world touching. And I've watched that clip over a dozen times, and I'm trying to understand what is going on in that moment. What is Dr. Peterson pressing up against? And it reminds me of Lewis. But again, I don't want to infer too much myself. I just want to leave that open-ended, though, and allow you to kind of speak into these two great thinkers.
Well, I'd need to leave it open-ended too, because my hope would be that Jordan will eventually explain it to us himself. But there is something scary. The interesting thing is that what Jordan said on that occasion is a bit like C.S. Lewis's description when he felt God was following him, was chasing him, the hound of heaven, that kind of idea. And it may be something similar. Certainly, what is happening, if we stand back from this, I have met a number, and there are many others, of course, of very brilliant intellectuals who have begun to see the thinness and inadequacy of materialistic explanations and have moved to the position where they know that there must be something more. And then they open their minds to considering that possibly that something more may be the revelation contained in Scripture. And certainly Jordan Peterson is moving in that direction very rapidly. Witness the fact that he's prepared to engage with Scripture, letting the text stand and engaging with it both himself and with a group of people, as he did in the book of Exodus. And I found it a great honor all those years ago to listen to Lewis giving his last lectures. Unfortunately, I never met him. And similarly, to listen and interact this time with Jordan Peterson, who certainly has an incredible insight into so many things, and so many young people, particularly young men, are listening to him. And I would very much hope that what he's doing for them is to awaken what Lewis called the sense of longing, that there's something more. Let's try and find what that something more is. So that would be the situation as I understand it.
One thing on that note, and there's really just two last topics that I want to hit before we run out of time here, but it's dovetailing exactly into what you just said, that something more. And the first one is justice, and the second one is hope. So let's talk about justice first, because what I look at around me is a culture in the West that is actually obsessed with justice, social justice, making sure that there's equality, making sure that wrong is contended with and that right is rewarded. And yet my question is, ultimately, in terms of ultimate eternal justice, is it possible for that to exist without the transcendent and without God? Have you ever come across an atheistic way of resolving this huge question of justice?
Well, fundamental to your question, it's really a question of morality and right or wrong. And my short answer to your question, I don't think there is a way around it. I think that Dostoevsky was right in his book, The Brothers Karamazov, when he put into the mouth of Ivan, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. And I think what that means is not that atheists cannot behave. Of course they can. We're all moral beings made in the image of God. It's that there's no rational justification for morality if you take the atheist view to its logical conclusion, which Richard Dawkins did in his book, The God Delusion. And that's where I think it is we read a sentence very much like the following, where he says, the universe is as exactly as you'd expect it to be if at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. It's a completely deterministic, atheistic point of view, which destroys not only justice, but the related concepts of good and evil. The irony of that is that Dawkins is prepared to protest against evil in the world. But if there's no good and no evil, that doesn't make any sense. And it seems here again to me that there's an analogous argument to the one I was making a little while ago about atheism and science not sitting very well together. Atheism and morality don't sit well together. And in fact, the famous philosopher who was an atheist, J.L. Mackie at Oxford, said that if there are absolute morals, then there's a very short distance from believing in them to the existence of God. And one can test that. It's very difficult to find anyone who believes that torturing infants is right. In other words, we are hardwired for morality. And there's evidence of that. And it's another strand. And it seems to me, if you stand back from it and ask yourself, on the basis of the New Testament, where you would expect the major evidences to lie. The Apostle Paul, at the beginning of Romans, said, well, creation's one of them, that evidences that there is a God and that he's powerful. But then the second one, he says, the existence of moral convictions in human beings. They accuse each other and they excuse each other, shows that they have built into them a concept of right and wrong. That, to my mind, is a very powerful evidence for God himself. I'm not, though, convinced that we live in a world where everybody is crying out for justice for everybody else. I think many people are screaming for justice for themselves and let the rest go hang. It seems to me that we live in a society, particularly in the West, that's far more fragmented than when I was younger, particularly in your country, but also in my own country. And it's a tragedy that moral standards have just gone absolutely to pieces. And that seems to me to be one of the reasons why people have turned away from God, even though they don't see it. That's a huge but a very important topic. And it's concepts of goodness, of rightness, of justice, and above all, of truth that need to be emphasized. But you need to take care. If you witness to the truth, you might get killed for it.
One last question. We have to end on the note of hope, I feel. And we're told in our culture that life is something like a melting ice cream cone. The purpose is simply to enjoy it while it lasts. That death is final. And this philosophy is leaving many people searching. You brought up Jordan Peterson and his work, and young men in particular, searching for something deeper, more meaning. So not just temporary happiness, but something lasting, So this is my question for you: is there a connection between meaning and hope? Can you have one without the other? And what can we give the viewer to this video as a signing off note to consider in terms of what their life is really for? And if God is true, maybe where is it going? Again, I don't want to lead this too much, but I think that meaning and hope and their connection to each other is very interesting to me.
Well, I don't think I've ever heard a sadder illustration of what people feel life is uh, than the one of a melting ice cream cone. What a contracted and tiny view of life that is, if that's all you found in it, because it makes certain completely false assumptions. And one is that when the ice cream disappears, it's gone, annihilated, no longer exists, that's it. But is that true? Well, if it is, then we'd better put up with it. But I don't believe it is, because the thing that brings me hope is what is the central message of Christianity, that there is a God, not only that there is a God, but that he is a personal God who has visited our planet. And God encoded himself in humanity and came in Jesus Christ to bring us hope and to bring us meaning. You know, hope, what is it? By definition, it is my expectation for the future. It's something that hasn't yet been realized. Have I any reason to hope for the future? And when people get into difficulty with their health, one of the things they almost immediately ask the doctors is there any hope, doctor? Is there any hope? Have you got any evidence that would give me some kind of expectation for the future that would transcend my present pain? Now, I think Christianity here is absolutely unique, because in this world we see there's a great deal of suffering, evil, and pain. And what Christianity has to offer, which is utterly unique, is a God who has suffered. Christ claimed to be God. Now, if that's true, then it's God on the cross. What was he doing there? Well, certainly at the very least, he was showing that God does not remain distant from our human suffering. Now, the key thing here, the thing that exploded in the world 20 centuries ago, that gave people hope and has been gone on doing it for all those centuries, is that there is something that transcends death, because death is the final darkness for most people that obliterates all hope. And the best they can do, if they're atheists, is to hope that their children will live on and give them some kind of a future. But for themselves, there is absolutely no ultimate hope. In other words, atheism is in that sense a hopeless faith. And it is a faith. People believe it. Now, what Christ has to offer us is that he died to do something that enables us to enter into a relationship with God and be freed from the horrific burden of the mess we've made of our own lives and possibly those of others, by dying for our sins. Now, that may sound to many people listening to me as mumbo jumbo. It is, in a sense, technical language, but it is very important to listen to what Christianity has to say before you reject it. Because I meet many people, young and old, they have no hope, they have no meaning in life. They want meaning, they're full of guilt, they've no peace. Christ offers to solve those problems. And the cost of him doing that is, of course, the logical one, that we need to recognize and acknowledge who he is, face our sin, repent of it, turn away from it, and turn to him for salvation. And then things begin to happen in a big way. We get peace with God, peace with ourselves, peace with other people, and a deep meaning in life. And not only that, a new power to live the lives that we were designed to live. I do not find that anywhere else. So let me put it this way, very bluntly. Jesus Christ competes with no one, because no one else offers me what he offers me. and I'm just over 80 years old. And I have lived with him for most of my life, at least 75 years of it. And it is absolutely thrilling to face the future knowing that if COVID takes me, or I'm killed in an accident, or I'm killed in a heart attack or a stroke, then I know that I have a peace with God and a life already within myself that transcends death and is going to go on forever in that bigger world that Plato got a very faint glimpse of. So I think there is hope to be had, but we need to face Christ's diagnosis of our lives, and we need to man up to the whole question of what is my relationship with God, and to learn to trust him, put our faith in him, because it will be evidence-based. I wouldn't be talking to you, Brandon, today if I didn't believe as a scientist that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And that story is the one that started Christianity going. And I've written a great deal about it in my books. And if I might mention so, I've got a website, johnlennox.org, and people can find me all over the internet, including the debates that you mentioned.
In light of this particular conversation that we've just had, which of your books would you recommend to someone who's listened through this and who is willing to take up that challenge that you just gave to actually take action on the ideas that we've just put forth and to take action on stepping toward God?
I would say a shorter book that I've written called Can Science Explain Everything, which readily available on Amazon, on Kindle, and so on. Can Science Explain Everything?
Fantastic. And I'll put that in the description as well for easy access. Dr. Lennox, I greedily, selfishly want to keep it going, but I know I ought not. I'm going to let you go, but I appreciate your time so much. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I sincerely hope that you were blessed by this conversation, regardless of where you're at on your thought journey about God or your spiritual journey in general. I was so honored to be able to sit across and talk with Dr. John Lennox. He's been a hero of mine for such a long time, and it was a tremendous privilege. One last quick shout out here to a friend of mine, Samuel, who runs a YouTube channel called Practical Wisdom. He helped connect me with Dr. John Lennox. He lives in the UK. They have a relationship. He has an amazing YouTube channel called Practical Wisdom where they have more conversations. So if you guys liked this video, I'm sure you'll like the videos that he has on his channel. Again, Practical Wisdom. Shout out to Samuel, awesome guy. The link will be in the description along with everything else provided in this video. With that being said, thank you guys so much for joining this conversation. If you're still listening, that's really cool. I hope it was a blessing. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks a lot. Bye.